So I've sat, for example, I was sitting in a container, an 8-foot by 8-foot by 20-foot repurposed trucking container with a family. He was a university professor. She was a cardiologist, and they had one of their 2 children, of their 3 children with them. And the other 2 had to be left behind in the country that they escaped from. And they had been waiting for over a year for their 4 and 7-year-old daughters to be able to join them. And they were just heartbroken.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to this podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hager, and I'm just an ordinary guy trying to tackle the issues, challenges, and tensions that we face in everyday life. And I do that by bringing you stories and conversations with people who are compelled to get into the trenches with me. My hope in each episode is to provide you with real, practical ways to take some action steps towards some of these challenges and issues, big or small, that we face each day. I'm not going to lie, in this series we start big and messy, the global refugee crisis. I traveled for 12 days with Joe Dunn of Reliant Missions, formerly Great Commission Ministries and Great Commission Europe, to see it for myself. Joe's dedicated the better half of his missions career working with missionaries and refugees in Europe centered around this refugee crisis. In part 1 of this 3-part series, Joe and I talk through what's happening in places like Turkey, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, to ordinary people who are fleeing tyranny, oppression, and terrorism, simply seeking safety and asylum. So up next, the first part of my conversation about the Refugee Highway with my friend Joe Dunn. Well, hey Joe, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks, Jason. I appreciate you inviting me in. Honored to be able to just share with you some of the things we went through.
So, Joe, as an introduction, maybe you could give us a little more detail about you, about Great Commission Europe and your path into full-time ministry.
Yeah, well, I'm with Great Commission Europe, GCE, and maybe I can start with my own journey. I'll keep it brief. I had grown up going to church, but never heard the gospel. So between my freshman and sophomore year at the university, I was working a summer job, and there was a guy at the job who his life was just different. He responded to people different. He smiled all the time. And I asked him what he had that I didn't have. And the next night we got together to talk about that. And it's the first time I'd ever heard the gospel. So I was in school at the time. I returned back to school to finish up my studies. But even while I was a student, God had grabbed a hold of my heart almost immediately. I began sharing the gospel with my friends. And I had really, it affected me significantly that here I was, somebody had gone to church who had grown up in the U.S. and I'd never heard this message. And I could see myself going around the U.S. and other places around the world to share that.
So we got to spend, so Chad Cobb and myself got to spend a whirlwind of 12 days with you in what's called the Refugee Highway. And so we took an exploratory trip into Amsterdam, into Germany, and into Greece. And I really just wanted to unpack it. I think it's going to help me process the trip just as much as anybody else listening. But maybe describe for me, what is the Refugee Highway and what has been your experience in the work that you've been doing with refugees?
So my work initially in Europe, our focus had been university students in the large urban centers. And over the last 6 or 7 years, there has been a huge migration of refugees into Europe. And although most, as I mentioned earlier, most of the cities, you'll find every nationality on the face of the earth, there's now, because of the war-torn Middle East and North Africa and the political and religious persecution in all of those places, there's just been an increase of refugees making their way there. And so these last 7 years, we've really focused on who's coming in, how are they getting in, where are they coming from, where are they landing. And so it's not our phrase, the Refugee Highway. It's probably been coined by others, but it really does describe what's going on. What we wanted to do is migration and immigration, they've been a part of the world's history. And even today, there's so many hotspots of migration and immigration around the world, whether that's people displaced within their own country, or people moving from country to country or continent to continent. And the specific migration you're talking about, or the Refugee Highway, is really those from the Middle and Near East and North Africa going through the southern parts of Europe, hopefully landing in the north and western parts of Europe. Maybe to add, we call it the Refugee Highway because there's really 4 stages. And I'm going to borrow from my wife and my daughter's training and vocation, the image of a hospital. And I say that because there's 4 stages along the way, and we use that in a generalization only to help paint the picture of what we see in each of the locations. For example, stage 1 would be the equivalent of the ER or the trauma hospital. So my wife, she works in a trauma 1 hospital. They get the worst of the worst, and they get people that when they land, they're in a really rough place. And so that would be, in terms of one of the highways, there's many highways coming from North Africa up into Spain, up into Italy, some into France. The part of the highway we're talking about is from Turkey to Greece. And the ER is on Lesbos Island. There's actually 5 islands there that refugees are landing, coming in from Turkey. Lesbos happens to be one of the closest geographically, ranging anywhere from a little over 6 miles to 18 miles from the coast of Turkey. And when refugees are coming, they've usually been hiding out in woods or forests for several days after making maybe treks of thousands of miles to get there. They've probably been held in camps, and they've escaped from those camps with the hopes of getting into Western Europe. And so when they land, for example, on Lesbos Island, they're traumatized. They're physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually traumatized. And so it's a lot like an ER where you're just dealing with the initial fallout of a tragedy. And so at stage 1, Lesbos Island, that's what they're helping with. We could talk more about our experience on Lesbos and Camp Moria. Stage 2 is really where people have gotten over that first trauma. So let's say they've been moved out of the ER and now they're in the ICU or CCU, a step-down unit. And at that place, they've got some form of legal status to be there temporarily while they're being vetted more permanently, or they've been given temporary stay prior to them being moved to the mainland of Greece or further up into Europe. So that would be the second stage. The third stage is they've landed in a more permanent place, though they're not permanently accepted into the place they've landed. Many want to get into Northern Europe, for example, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Great Britain. So stage 3 would be somebody who has been allowed to travel or has made their way and is seeking asylum, a permanent asylum in the country of destination. And so they're no longer in the same position that they were in with the initial phases, but they still are not that far removed. That journey can be anywhere from a few days once they land on the shores of somewhere in Europe to a few years.
And I think one of the issues there too, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it depends on where they're fleeing from. Is that right?
Yes, I mean each of them can that are seeking asylum. They have their own reasons. There are several that are coming from again the war-torn areas that are obvious, like Syria. Others are coming for economic reasons. And so you get many who are just trying to get in for economic reasons. There's no hope of them earning a living at home. And so even the vetting process all along the refugee highway by the governments that are processing each person, they're taking into account their understood exposure to the tragedies, the atrocities that are happening back in their country. And so those that are the most visible, such as the Syrians, maybe some of the Yazidis who come from northern Iraq, where they're coming from those war-torn areas where their life is in danger, they're more readily accepted. Others coming for just economic reasons or political persecution reasons, they're not all as readily embraced. And so it doesn't mean they won't get asylum. It just means the influx of so many, they take those that deem most serious, most endangered first, and then they go down through the list of those they consider least endangered for the reasons that they're seeking asylum.
What's the longest that you've heard that asylum process, if someone would be granted asylum somewhere, what's the longest that you've heard someone has waited?
Well, 2 years ago, I was sitting in a camp in Hamburg with somebody from Ghana, and we struck up a great conversation. That's a story in and of itself, just of what he had seen trying to cross. The refugee highway you and I are talking about is the refugee highway from Turkey to Greece. There has been a significant highway coming up from Libya and North Africa, and countless thousands, that's thousands, into the tens of thousands have lost their lives, recorded lost their lives. And he happened to be one of those fortunate ones coming in from Ghana who was seeking for health reasons and for economic reasons to be there. He'd been in the camp in Hamburg for 6 years and was still waiting.
Wow.
So he had no official status. He wasn't allowed to work. All he could do was sit in this camp. And so, 6 years. So
it's just so hard to comprehend how long that 6 years must have felt like to someone in that situation. Shifting gears back towards the last stage, using the hospital analogy, maybe unpack that a little bit more for us.
The fourth stage then is are refugees who have made their way into the country where they're going to be granted asylum, and they are granted asylum. And so they've gone through whatever the legal process is, and sometimes that can be, as I said, weeks or years. And there are many who are still in that initial process now who are denied repeatedly. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in stage 4, it's kind of like the person's been released. Stage 3 would be, okay, now you're sent out into the hospital room and you still need to be cared for. You need to be watched over. Stage 4 would be a little bit like outpatient care.
Right.
You're now accepted into the country. You just need to be checking back in. There's certain criteria you have to meet. You've got to learn language. You've got to begin to seek a job. You've got to enroll family in schools. You've got to do everything you would do like you would be moving anywhere. You have to remake yourself. And so stage 4 is you're much more settled. More than likely, you probably will have found similar or like people groups near you. And so you start to assimilate to the culture, but also continue to hold on to your cultural setting, especially as you can find those that are of similar culture, similar language group. There's another group of people, we don't call it a stage, and that's the people that have repeatedly been denied access just because their story is not compelling enough to allow for their favorable asylum.
Right.
And so once they've exhausted all of their appeals and they're denied, they're either immediately deported back to their country, their passport country, or many go undocumented, which means they go off the grid. They're no longer necessarily in any kind of system that allows them the housing, the stipend for food and clothing that the government gives to individuals who are either in process of seeking asylum or have been granted asylum. And so now you've got people who have no way of making a living, no way of having a home, places to stay, and yet their home country circumstances have not changed.
Right.
For many of them, if they were to return, it would be at the cost of their life. If nothing else, they would have the same disadvantages that they had prior, which means they'd be in the same place of not being able to earn a living, provide for family.
I think the hospital analogy is really helpful for someone who may not have a picture of what this crisis looks like. And I've told you this. I'm the first to admit that as an American, I feel like this country has sheltered the news of what's happening. You can find information now that I know what to look for. But going into this trip, when we left, I embarrassingly, I guess would be the best way to describe it, didn't know a whole lot. Didn't know much about what was happening. Didn't know why people were leaving. I'd heard the rhetoric. I think that's kind of the American rhetoric of issues of terrorism and infiltration. But when you talk to families, when you talk to people, when you talk to individuals that have been through this process, there are some heartbreaking stories.
Yeah, I think for me, that's it really has captured my heart. As I mentioned earlier, there are people that have had to be refugees, internally displaced in their own country or elsewhere, and just sitting, listening to stories of the refugees, whether they're coming in from, they're Turkish coming from Turkey, or they're Yemeni coming in, or Syrian, or Afghan, or Iraqi, or Moroccan, or Congolese, or Eritrean, Sudanese, story after story of the human atrocities that have been committed against them, against their families along the way. And it's just mind-boggling in this day and age to think that the things that are going on are happening. The Refugee Highway, for me, just one comment is it brings out the best of humanity, and it's brought out the worst of humanity.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I've sat, for example, I was sitting in a container, an 8-foot by 8-foot by 20-foot repurposed trucking container with a family. He was a university professor. She was a cardiologist, and they had one of their two children of their three children with them. And the other two had to be left behind in the country that they escaped from.
Oh,
and they had been waiting for over a year for their 4 and 7-year-old daughters to be able to join them. And they were just heartbroken. And so here are people who were at the peak of their careers and their profession, who were in the wrong political party and needed to escape with the shirts on their back, could not take all their children with them, only their 18-month-old infant, and the other two had to be left with family, and they could not be reunited with them and hadn't been for over a year. So you hear story after story, or we've talked in Stockholm, we were talking with a group of young Afghani gentlemen, and we asked them would they be willing to share their story and all except for one said that their stories were too painful. These are late teenagers, and one of them was saying the reason it's so painful is we watched our families being executed right in front of us, and we needed to escape. And so you just hear of the human atrocities along the way, and you figure, what is going on in this day and age that these things are happening? Yeah. And it's just unfathomable. So,
and I think that's why after taking the trip, I think that's why it's been hard for me to really process a next step because of what I didn't know. And I know that sounds odd, but to hear these stories and think, why am I not hearing about this every day? Why is this not all over the evening news reports and, all over the internet and all over mainstream media? And I don't have the answer for that, but it's certainly it really is a crisis, and, I think aptly named.
Probably in the last decade, between 6 and 8 million people have been displaced from their home countries, these war-torn, religious and political persecuted peoples. The peak was in 2015 and 16 when we heard the most, and that was over 1.5 million people from the Middle East, Near East, and North Africa who were seeking that. And so 6 to 8 million people doesn't sound like a lot in the grand scheme until you put it into the size of your own city or your own state, and you figure out, oh my goodness, the population of my state, or most of it, are the amount of people that we're talking about that had to up and leave overnight from their location and find places where they could land in order to have safety, in order to remake themselves.
Yeah, it's unthinkable. And so we as an organization here at River Ridge Church, we have been prayerfully seeking ways to get plugged in and ways to help. And part of that is by talking to you and trying to give folks an understanding of what this is, what's happening, what has happened. And again, I've shared a few stories from my trip to a number of different people that I'm in communication with on a regular basis, and I'm still at a loss for the looks on their face. Why are they so surprised? Why do they act like, oh my God? It was my same response. I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe in 2019, and this is the situation that's happening in some of these places.
Well, I think we'll talk maybe more towards the end about what's one thing or a few things we who are living in a completely different environment, how can we get engaged and involved?
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, the hard part is to get back on a plane, having sat down and heard the stories of people's perils of life and the endangerment they were in and the things they experienced, and then figure, hey, I've got to come home and figure out whether I want chocolate or vanilla ice cream.
And just the insignificant things. I had this conversation with someone today. It's like just the perspective that you get about how fortunate and blessed that we are just by living in this country. It's tough to wrestle with. It's been hard for me. There you go. That's part one of my conversation with Great Commission Europe's Joe Dunn, and just a small taste of my experience in learning more about this refugee crisis. In episode 2, Joe and I talk about our 12 days in Europe together, our visits to refugee camps, our conversations with families, with missionaries who are really doing all they can to offer hope to people in a desperate situation. As of recording this episode, I've been home from this trip for about 3 weeks and still really just trying to process everything. The conversations I had, what I experienced there. With an issue this big that I knew so little about, I'm just struggling with how to respond and how to engage in the best way. As a teaser for episode 3, Joe gave me some great practical advice on action steps that I could take, that we could take, that your organization could take as a way to plug in and start being a part of a solution. So don't miss episode 2 or episode 3. If you'd like to know more about this show or others in this series, please visit riverridge.org/podcast. There you'll find show notes and a variety of resources from each episode. And if you feel compelled to take some type of action or have any questions or feedback, I would certainly love to hear from you. You can email me directly at jasonhager@riverridge.org. That's JASONHAGER @riverridge.org. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time.